It's important when you work with SharePoint that you understand the anatomy, the architecture, and the terminology used in SharePoint Online. Let's start first of all with the tenant. The tenant is the Office 365 subscription that you have. The tenant is the SharePoint Admin Center. The SharePoint is where you create SharePoint sites, where you set up permissions, and you basically manage and administrate your SharePoint. So that's known as the tenant. Next, let's look at the term site. The site is actually your organization website. The SharePoint site is actually an intranet, and the site contains many pages, or maybe just one page. It contains documents, usually in libraries, and a site will have security and permission settings, and potentially a site will have a number of web parts, such as calendars, news, lists, and announcements. So a site is basically a website, and your tenant could have one or many sites. Now, when people talk about sites, they often talk about subsites. A subsite is a site within another site. A site and a subsite are basically the same thing. It's just a site underneath another site, much like the site collection illustrates. We have, for example, a root site, which is the home site, and then underneath that we have another site or subsite called marketing. And underneath that we have another site or subsite called production, and another site or subsite support. So basically site and subsite are the same thing. When we refer to a root site is actually the parent site. And really this is the only true site, because every other site is technically a subsite. A site collection, as the name implies, is actually a collection of SharePoint sites. It includes a root site, as we see here in green, and it also includes subsites, as we see here in blue. A site collection is the sharing of the navigation settings and the sharing of the permissions. Typically, the parent site or the root site contains the navigation settings and the permissions that are the admin settings by default for the subsites. These can be customized, but a subsite carries those settings from the parent site. So moving away from the terms site, root site, site collections and subsites, what is a document library? A document library is actually a web part that stores files or documents. It's actually a library that organizes documents in folders, and it allows you to have all the functionality that goes with document management, such as document previewing, versioning of documents, so you can have multiple versions starting from the first version to the last version, and we'll be looking at that, and checking in and checking out documents. So a document library stores documents. Then we have what's called a list. Now a list is actually also a web part, just like a document library, but it holds content, not documents. It can have documents attached, but it's not actually holding documents. A list is a collection of rows and columns that contain data, and this is often referred to as metadata. Examples of lists include a calendar, a contacts list, a task list. There's all sorts of lists that you'll discover in SharePoint. Folders is another term that we hear in SharePoint. And just like traditional folders, when doing file management, folders are used to organize files and data. And folders typically are inside of a document library, which is equivalent to a filing cabinet. So in a traditional sense, we used to have drives, and they used to be our filing cabinets. Now we have document libraries as our filing cabinets, and folders inside of those libraries to organize our files and data. Another term, or part of the anatomy of SharePoint, are pages. A page is what displays information that you see. Each site in the site collection will have at least one page. and a page typically contains web parts. Web parts are information such as news, such as documents, and it's basically the page that you view and interact with when you're looking at a SharePoint site. But you'll also hear the word modern site pages. With SharePoint Online, modern site pages became available to you, and these pages are fast and easy to audit. They support multiple rich multimedia content, and these pages are basically built with web parts. So what are web parts? Web parts are very much like apps on your phone. There are a variety of web parts that come with SharePoint, but there's also third-party web parts. So there's a huge variety of SharePoint apps or web parts, and these include things such as document libraries, they're a web part. So are calendars, so are task lists, and even announcements. You can create links that are web parts, and you can even embed social media feeds to Facebook, Twitter, and so on. A web part could even be an executable that performs a specific function, such as a query search. So web parts are like apps on your phone. And lastly, we've heard of the term metadata. Now, metadata is data that describes a document above and beyond the actual file name. Metadata includes things like the file size, the document type, the date it was created, the date it was modified, and perhaps even the author. This metadata is data that enables you, the user, to be able to sort, filter, group, and find documents by. And those are the main terms that we hear in SharePoint Online. And those terms are used to describe the anatomy and the architecture of SharePoint sites, collections, and objects.